opinions.
That's funny.
Okay. Oh, we're recording.
Yeah.
Hi. We're back.
We're back. In the time between last episode and this episode, we found the name of the boy band. I know you were all wondering and waiting, and it was
On the edge of your seat.
Yes, of course, it was +1. If you were wondering, you can look up. You have to Google +1 band because there was a movie that was released called +1. That is not the same thing. But if you look up the band, you will see that was the boy band I was obsessed with as a young person.
And valid, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you.
So by the time that I got to high school, I was very deep in my emo proto-goth phase.
So we're just jumping in.
So I was more into heavy rock at that point.
I just mean
oh yeah, we're just jumping.
We're not recapping what we were talking about. Okay. All right.
No
you
recaps.
You don't get a recap. You don't get to, if you didn't hear it, go back to the last episode.
Yes.
We're talking.
Listen to it on double speed. We'll be fine.
We're continuing to talk about us leaving evangelical culture. So now, please continue your story.
So I was in high school by this point. I was at a church that was very hard pushing to become a mega church. We were really being pushed to do everything bigger and better. And I will say the more that we did that, I feel like church was still very social. A terrifying amount of my social development happened in church parking lots and in church vans and in church rooms. But it became less of a community and more of a business very quickly. It felt like it didn't feel quickly at the time, but looking back, I only went to that church from the time I was 15 to the time I was 18. Or not 15, 13 to 18. So within a span of 5 years, it went from being very much a community-driven enterprise to a money-driven enterprise, which is how mega churches work, really. But this was really where my deconstruction journey started to begin. I didn't call it that. I didn't have that terminology for it or know that this was a process that other people were going through at the time. But I was already dealing with a lot of cognitive dissonance that I couldn't just ignore. I had too many critical thinking skills to ignore it at that point. The thought-ending cliches were no longer working. I was also dealing with stuff that I hadn't had to deal with before. I had some traumatic shit in my very early years, think 3 to 5. And as a kid, I got therapy. Bless my grandmother. She sent me to therapy for it, and that helped a lot. And then I kind of just didn't think about it anymore until I got to be a teenager with a brain that wanted to think about things. And you know where that leads. So I
suspect where that leads. I don't know.
I'll just say this, that the really deep, and I'm not going to get too detailed about it for a couple of reasons, but
yeah.
I'll just say that the deep emphasis on purity culture and virginity and purity that was happening in the youth group, especially geared toward young women, was very damaging to me during this time. Yeah. For a lot of reasons. And very damaging to not just me. I wasn't, in a way, it's weird. I feel like it hurt me more and it damaged my faith in this whole system I was part of more to see what that did to other girls than it did for me to think about myself. Yeah. And how it related to me. Yeah. Nothing makes you start to question how much your youth pastor really knows what he's talking about. Sitting with a friend of yours who's crying because she feels like she needs forgiveness for something that happened to her that wasn't her choice. And because I had therapy, I already knew that wasn't her fault because I knew that what happened to me wasn't my fault. And I didn't blame myself for it. And I knew that God didn't blame me for it either. So I already felt that there was fundamentally something that the people I was supposed to be able to trust either weren't thinking about or didn't care about or didn't want to acknowledge because it would make it harder for them to push what they were pushing. Yeah. And that was a big point for me. This was also a lot of like me and a lot of my friends were going through a lot of hard stuff. And so the thought-ending cliches were working less, and the questions that prompted people to say them were happening way more. Like, why is God letting my friend get treated like this by her parents? Why did God allow this to happen to this other friend of mine? Why did God allow this to happen to me? Like, why is everyone I know suffering so much if God loves us and wants good things for us and has the power to make that happen? And there wasn't a good answer. All of the answers were either stop thinking about it, you're a puny human brain and you can't understand the plan of God, or almost worse, God is making you suffer so that you can do something for him. Like, God is making you suffer so that you're better equipped to send his message out into the world.
Not to entirely derail your story.
Oh, God.
But imagine that narrative surrounding the unexpected death of a sibling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it fucking sucked.
And I feel like you get that a lot with anything hard. When something bad happens to you, you lose something, you lose your house, you lose a family member, somebody dies, somebody gets cancer.
Yep.
Whatever happens, there's always that, oh, God has a plan. This was part of his plan.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to say, well, his plan fucking sucks.
Yep.
And his plan's kind of sadistic bullshit, but you can't help but think it, especially when you're an angry teenager. And
again, not to make your story about my story, but like, yeah, that's very relatable of like, the questions I'm asking are bigger than the answers you're giving me.
Yeah. There was also an aspect of it where, and this was not a connection I made at the time, but it was a connection I made looking back. I feel like there's a heavy correlation between some of the glorification of suffering that Christians do and that Christian media did, and just how many friends I had that self-harmed, including myself. Like, Kill Me, Heal Me by Skillet is a hell of a song to push towards teenagers who are already thinking about their own death a horrific amount.
Yeah. Thinking about death on the scale of like, everyone I love is going to die and I might get left behind because I don't have the same level of faith that everyone else does.
Oh, and then also, like, it is joy to suffer for Christ. Like, there's so much equating joy with suffering, equating suffering with joy, suffering being something that you should seek out and be happy about. To put it bluntly, no wonder so many of my friends were cutting themselves.
Right. Well, and exactly, like my immediate reaction to that now is, what the fuck?
Right?
Like that is not a normal response to suffering. Even if you just think about, which I don't want to get into this argument in this episode, but even if you just think about, like, from a evolutionary perspective, which is not something that Christians are often thinking about it from, but like, if you're thinking about it from that, like, why would I continue to put myself in a place of suffering? I will eventually die.
Yeah.
What good comes from that?
Well, this is why when some people go as far as to say that Christianity is a death cult, I understand where they're coming from.
Oh, yeah.
Because everything is focused on what happens after you die. Everything, like, you're not allowed to enjoy your life now. You're not allowed to make the most of your life now. You're not allowed to focus on your life now. Any time you spend doing that is considered time wasted at best. Time spent in service of evil at worst, because you're supposed to be focusing on what comes after. You're supposed to be looking forward to dying.
Building your kingdom in heaven.
Well, why make anything better here then?
Yeah.
Why alleviate anybody's suffering? Like, I feel like that's, without getting into it, because we could have a whole episode on just that, I feel like that's at the root of a lot of issues with the world, is there's so many people in the world who are clinging to that idea that, oh, we don't have to put in the work to make anything better now. In fact, it's useless to do so, because we should just be focusing on suffering through it while we have to, and then we can die, and then we can go to heaven, and then we can enjoy ourselves.
I don't mean to derail again or tangent us too far off, but I do want to just ask, were you ever privy to the debate of, like, old Earth versus new Earth?
Oh my God.
So yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, are you talking about New Earth creationism?
Yes. Versus Old Earth creationism.
Not only was I privy to it, we had a guy come to our church to specifically talk to us about it.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar, the Old Earth versus New Earth debate is essentially like there are some people who believe that when God created the earth, he created it old so that the more that we test it, the more it will seem old, but it's actually only been around for like 4,000 to 6,000 years. And the New Earth people say, no, it's only been around for like 6,000 or 8,000 years. And this is how we know why. And like all of the stuff that dates it older than that is wrong.
Which is like on both sides. I'm like, what are you doing? First of all, if you're going to say that all of the tests you could possibly run are wrong, what's the point in ever thinking at all? If your answer to...
You have gotten to the heart of the problem. And it took you 2 sentences.
I'm so frustrated. But then the second one too is pretty bad. Or the first one, the older thing, is like, what kind of... And we're starting to get... I might be getting ahead of myself, but since we're here...
Sorry.
If you have a God who is all-knowing,
mm-hmm.
all-seeing,
mm-hmm.
all-powerful, and all-good...
Mm-hmm.
And your God, who is all of these things, has created a system by which you either have faith in him or suffer eternal torture.
Yeah.
He didn't have to create it that way. That's what he chose to do.
Yep.
And he doesn't want anybody to be tortured, but he'll do it if you don't have faith. Why the ever-loving fuck would that guy put little, like, traps into the world to fuck with your faith? Like, why would he make the earth seem old so that if you test it, it seems old to make you question whatever you might think?
Yeah.
Why? Who even thought that, like, what Calvinist ass motherfucker said that was what was going on?
I mean, it's funny because it's sad, and it's sad because it's true. Because that sort of mentality, you're like, I'm hot.
My blood pressure is rising.
No, I'm right there with you because I have had this debate with other people who are believers, and it is endlessly frustrating to try to logic this out because it's not logical. It just isn't. And I think that, to me, again, as we're like having this conversation about deconstruction, it comes back to, like, if I'm made in God's image, on some level, if it seems crazy to me, it probably is crazy to God. Yeah. Like, if God is real at all, then a part of, like, if he really is real and really does exist, and I am created in his image, then some of what I experience has to be a part of what he experiences, right? And so, like, if that's the case, if I see something and I think, wow, that's apeshit crazy, God probably would think that too. Like, if that's my initial reaction, it's probably his initial reaction.
Right? That's getting into the nitty gritty of, like, where I am now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I totally derailed you.
No, don't. Because it's true. I'm gonna go back.
Okay.
I'm gonna go back to, like, kind of how I got to this point.
Gotcha. I'll go back to silently nodding and drinking my water.
No, I love your interjections because it's so real. Like, why?
Mm-hmm.
The contradictions, and you know what? I'm just gonna get into it. The contradiction. The problem is,
I unleashed something, and I kind of love it.
The problem is, and I'm going to drop one of my resources for anybody who wants to do some further reading on deconstruction.
Yeah, do it.
Because the way that she states and explains things is so helpful.
Yeah.
But this person, their TikTok handle is I Blame Bill, and they do all of these videos kind of talking through the logical inconsistencies and fallacies inherent to Christian doctrine. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they said that was just a huge light bulb moment for me is, the problem is that Christianity is a vertical morality. It isn't about what makes logical sense. It isn't about how things affect the people around you. It's what is right is determined by who has the power and what that person says is right.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, no matter how nonsensical, no matter how apeshit stupid, no matter how cruel something is, if it's the word of God, it is right because it is the word of God.
Yeah.
Not regardless of the effect it has on the world, on the people who believe it, on the people that are having to interact with the people who believe it. And that was such a light bulb moment for me, because it was like, oh my God, no pun intended. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole problem right there. But before I ever got to that, I was still struggling with all of these inconsistencies, and just so much hypocrisy. Okay. And nobody's perfect. And that's one of the things about Christianity that made it make sense probably longer than it should have, was the massive amount of room that is given for imperfection, because anything can be forgiven if you just ask for it. I was constantly being confronted with hypocrisy from the people around me in a way that didn't feel like a mistake they were making. It felt like a choice that was being made. Like the whole tattoo thing with my grandmother from the last episode is an example, but stuff like, and again, this is me as a little tiny true believer. I really believed it. Speaking in tongues was a big thing in every church I ever went to consistently. I don't know what led me to this conclusion, but for whatever reason, when I was a teenager, I really believed that speaking in tongues, like pretending to do it when you weren't really doing it, was like an unforgivable sin. Like, I knew it was a sin regardless, but it was, I really thought it was one of the big unforgivable ones.
Yeah.
I think it had something to do with like blasphemy against the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's who's supposed to be doing the talking when you're doing that, right?
Right.
I remember being in the church basement before the megachurch became a megachurch, and I came upon somebody who was rehearsing their speaking in tongues. Wow. That they were going to be doing later that night. And even if I hadn't believed that it was an unforgivable sin to do that, I still would have been horrified, because it was, oh, this is fake. It's not just that this is not a gift I've ever been given, because I refused to fake it. No matter how much I was ever pressured, I was terrified of ever faking that.
Yeah. Because
I thought if I did that, I would go to hell.
Yeah.
I really believed that. If people did that, I thought that it had to be real. It just wasn't a gift that I had been given.
Right.
And then I come upon somebody rehearsing like it was a performance, because it was. And for me, that was a moment where it wasn't just, oh, that's not real when it happens. It's not just me that hasn't been given that gift. It's a performance. And then I thought, other people do not believe this to the level that I do, because if they did, they would not be doing that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way they would do that if they really believed it. And that kind of created a crack for me, realizing that even the moments where I felt like I didn't have enough faith, A, I wasn't alone in that. And B, there were a lot of people who were just going through motions around me. Watching how people treated each other, especially as the church became more and more of a business. I had a couple of instances where friends of mine were treated really terribly by the church. It kind of broke my faith in those people. And my faith in those people was all that I was hanging on for at that point, because the faith itself was so shaky for me. Like, I was already having trouble with things like the Bible excusing rape and slavery and murder, as long as the person murdering it was the right person. Like, I was already having trouble with all of that. I was already having trouble with the basic doctrine and all of the thought-ending cliches. And then the people themselves were so disappointing on top of that. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand. Like, I used to hear all the time, oh, you can't let people rob you of your faith. And they don't realize that sometimes the people are all you're staying for at that point.
Yeah.
It's not that the people rob you of your faith. It's that the faith was already shaky, because the foundations it's built on are shaky.
Yeah.
And the people are just the final blow. That was the final blow for me, where I didn't really go through a deconstruction journey at that point. I just stepped away from it and tried not to think about it. The deconstruction happened way later. I stopped being active in the drama group, and I could drive by that point. So I would, every Sunday, I would drive myself to church separately from my grandmother. And I would arrive, or no, I would arrive before her. I would arrive before her, so when she got there, she'd see my car in the parking lot. And I would be like in the fellowship hall. At that point, it was a foyer, in the foyer with people. Like she would see me talking to people, and people would say that they'd see me. And by this point, we were in a huge building. It was huge. You could be in there and not know who all was in there. And there was even, I think, an overflow room at that point because it was that big.
Yeah.
And we had programs. So I would get the program so that I knew what was being talked about. And then I would wait, and then I would leave. I would go, there was a place called Michael's Coffee Shop. I would go there. I would stay. And I would stay until just before church was supposed to let out because it always ran over. It never was short. And then I would come back, park in the same spot, and then I would go back in. And so she would see me when she came out. And if she asked me ever what the service was about, I would be able to tell her. And if she asked me where I was sitting, I'd say I was in the overflow room. Because I could not, it went from me feeling like, I remember that feeling of conviction, like you need to go to the altar, or like something is speaking to you. It was that, like something in me rebelling against being there, like wanting me to walk out the door. And at the time I thought it was because Jesus just did not reside there anymore. Now I was like, yeah, you reached a breaking point with the cognitive dissonance and with the ability to put up with the bullshit. And I never went back.
Good for you.
I think I went back once. Like in college, I think I visited one time, and it was such an uncomfortable experience that I didn't stay the whole time.
Good for you. Good for you. So, after all that, what do you have to say about leaving evangelical culture in general?
In general? Oh boy.
You are prepared.
So I think the thing that people don't think about is that it hurts.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, I'm excited to go, sin all I want and not have to get up early on Sundays anymore, etc. It's a loss.
Yeah.
Like it's a loss of something that made you feel like, being raised Christian gave me a lot of terror as a child, but it also gave me a lot of comfort.
Yeah.
And it also gave me a sense of certainty that I have never found again. Because it turns out when you switch to a horizontal morality where what's right is determined by the effect that things have on other human beings, the answers aren't so easy anymore.
Yeah.
And when you're not basing everything on what the person with the most power tells you, you have to think about it for yourself in every situation. And that's a lot harder, and it's a lot scarier. And there's a lot of wondering, am I doing this right? There's very little certainty. And that's really hard to deal with. It also kind of felt like to some extent, losing a part of the relationship I had with my grandmother at the time. Because, we used to talk about everything. And this was something I couldn't really talk to her about anymore because I could never be honest about what I was thinking or feeling. I lost a lot of friends. There are a lot of people in this world that I was very, very close to that I never spoke to again. And that probably think that I'm some kind of hedonistic degenerate and probably tell cautionary tales about me if they ever think about me at all. And in some ways it was losing a big source of comfort. Like the thing you were saying about your brother praying in certain situations. I still do that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I think that there's no God. I don't know that I'm there. I don't think that there is a God that is all powerful and all good, because I don't think with the world we live in, both can be true. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny that both could be true.
I would have to agree with that.
But it was relearning how to think about the world. And there are still moments where I come across some random thing that I just haven't examined since then. And I feel like a very intense negative association emotionally with that thing. And then I realize, oh, there's nothing wrong with this.
Yeah.
It's just something I haven't encountered since I was deep in evangelical Christianity.
Yeah.
And I haven't re-examined how I feel about that now that I'm not looking at it through that lens. I run across little random things like that all the time.
Oh, yeah. I had a friend tell me recently that I often give off homeschool kid vibes, which I wasn't offended by, because it's true. Like, I give off those vibes of like, yeah, I don't know, because that's a part of the culture that I wasn't exposed to. And the reality is, I don't know, because that's a part of culture I was hidden from. I was actively kept away from. You know, and my partner will sometimes tease me about it, and sometimes it's funny, and sometimes he'll tease me about it, and I get upset, right? Because it's like some of those things are connected to wounds that are bigger than just, yeah, I went to church for a while when I was younger, and I'm over it now. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
But I'll get more into my side of things. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I will say that was literally just the beginning of the deconstruction. Like, there was a lot of stuff that I went through after that, talking, like, there was that Stephen Fry interview he gave years and years ago where how dare you about God. That was a light bulb moment. I was really big into Tori Amos in high school.
Nice.
And like, I read everything there was to read about her. I did a book report on her.
Nice.
And some of the things she said about her own evangelical Christian upbringing and how she felt about it were light bulb moments. I read a Mary Oliver poem at nerd camp, and it changed my life.
Nice.
She said, "You do not have to be good." That was actually, I was going to bring it and I forgot. I have a diary from that time.
Yeah.
And I wrote a whole 3 pages front and back of me scribbling as faster than trying to write as fast as my brain was thinking. Like, no, you don't get it. I do have to be good. If I'm not good, this will happen and this will happen. And everyone I know will think this and all of that. And I was right. That is what happened when I realized I didn't have to be good. But I did realize I didn't. At least not by their definition of good.
Yeah.
That was something that I got to and had to really define for myself. And that was hard. And it's still hard because it never stops.
It doesn't. I think that's the one thing. Anyway, we'll get into it when we get to my part. We're going to go to Woman of the Week now.
Yay!
Woo! Hello. In editing, I, Chris, have realized that I wasn't proud of how we talked about our Woman of the Week. And because this podcast is about doing the things that we want to do in the way that we want to do them, I've decided to eliminate it and try again. So this week, I want you to look in the mirror, regardless of gender, tell yourself that you are a goddamn treasure, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Okay. Are we ready?
Are we ready?
For my last part?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we are.
Okay. So, where did we leave off? Oh, I was in college. So I got married. I think mostly that was motivated of this, this is what you're supposed to do. Go to college, you're supposed to get a degree, you're supposed to get married, and then never use your degree because your husband will keep you for all of your days. Well, I never really did end up using my degree, even though a lot of it was in radio communications, and I was on the radio for 3 years, and now I'm doing a podcast. So good. So
you're using your degree right now.
So I'm using it now for recreational purposes. And this is why I bought bad microphones, because it's been a hot minute since I've done it. Anyway, I knew a lot more about theology than my husband did, than my ex-husband did. I knew a lot more about it. Not to say that he was unintelligent in any way, but I think that he was supposed to be the spiritual head of the household. That's how Christian homes are structured, right? When we talk about that vertical morality, it's God gives the authority to the pastor, then the pastor gives the authority to the man, and then the man distributes the wisdom to the women and children. Mm-hmm. That's great if the women aren't educated, right? That works wonderfully if you don't know more about the Bible than your husband does. And so we would have these late night discussions where I'm talking about these really nuanced theological ideas, or really sort of basic theological ideas. I think I explained old earth versus new earth to him. And we were having these discussions of things that to me, a lot of it had been sorted out in high school because I was having those discussions with the other 5 young women in my school, and like with teachers and stuff, but that wasn't really the conversation that he was having on the college level. So anyway, so we start grinding gears for a lot of different reasons, but that was definitely one of them. And eventually I start seeing a therapist because my cognitive dissonance at this point, like the mental gymnastics just weren't getting it done. I just was not capable of really processing all of the things that I was thinking and the reality that I was having to live. I think when I think back now as to like why I hung on for so long, like you were saying that it was the people, right? Like you wanted to be around the people. It wasn't the people for me. A lot of the people were not wonderful in my world. Some of them were emotionally and psychologically abusive or financially abusive. You know, it was not a great environment. It wasn't a wonderful community. However, I think the thing that kept me there for so long was this idea of seeing my sister again. You know, at the time when she passed away, she was my best friend. She was my world. She was everything that I had. I think believing that I was going to get that again was really what kept me there, right? That all of this was worth it because eventually, someday, I'll be able to restore that relationship. And so I started going to therapy and started working on some of my own stuff. A lot of it had to do with expectations around how I lived my life after my sister passed. And as, you know, we're sort of processing through some of those things, I'm realizing she's gone, like really gone. Like she's not going to walk through the door someday or come home after our, you know, like some trip or something, right? Like there is no getting a message to her from here, you know, like, and some of the things that I'd really been trying through my faith and that experience to like hold on to, it just kind of hit me like, that's not going to happen. And the more I hold on to that, the more I'm going to dig myself into this dissonance, into this like convincing myself that I'm not in pain, that I'm not upset when these are the things that are really happening around me. And it's interesting, like you cite like different poems and things that sort of like hit you in those moments. For me, it was Futurama. And I love that show so very, very much. But I remember something about the humor that was used in that show, something about the way that it sort of walked this line of science and ridiculous, really just like married these ideas for me that had been so opposite for a really long time. That like you can believe in science and have a good life. You can believe in something other than Jesus and not be a terrible person. My brother left the church before I did. And I saw the way that my parents handled that. And I think it's fair to say they would probably say that they didn't handle it very well. You know, because there's this belief, there's sort of like the scary atheist outside your door, right? Like that anybody who doesn't believe in God is, I'm like looking at the time. I'm like, do I have enough time to tell this story? I might. We'll see. But it's like any like scary atheist that is outside the door is like demon possessed, or they're like some sort of flavor of evil that is unimaginable and like only wants to drag you away from faith, right? When that person's your brother, who like my brother at the lowest point in my life literally saved my life, he's the evil one.
Yeah, that,
Like, he's the one who's bad. He's the one who I can't trust when I go to talk to my parents about the pain I'm going through and they say, well, just pray more. But my brother's the one who actually shows up. How is that not Christ's love? So I think I initially moved to this space that was like, I think we just have a misunderstanding of what the love of Christ is, right? Like there are just people who really can understand it and act it, and then there are people who can't. And that idea, after I got divorced, just quickly fell apart. And I was like, nah, I think that people are mostly good, and this idea that we're born evil is really the idea that's been fucking us up.
That resonates so hard with me because that was part of it for me too. Like, you know, we had been told, you know, that not believing in Jesus, not being a Christian was going to make somebody be a terrible person because they had no reason to be good.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in my early life, I felt like that was supported to some extent by the people in my life that weren't Christians because they let me down a lot.
Yeah.
In ways that really had nothing to do with if they were Christians or not, now that I know, like, look back.
Right.
But there was a correlation there for me, and my little baby brain said, oh, that's why.
Yeah.
And then as I got older and I met more kinds of people, I went to college and I met more people, and I realized that there's actually not really that much of a correlation. Like, I remember my senior year of high school, I was in a psychology class, and there were 2 Satanists in that class, and they were the nicest boys.
Yeah.
They were the nicest, kindest, most respectful guys, and we had such interesting conversations, and they would challenge me on my beliefs without ever being cruel or disrespectful to me.
Right.
Like, that really rocked my world in a way, because I was like, how is... They're supposed to be evil.
Yeah. Satanists are the bomb.com.
Oh,
I dated a Satanist for a little while. Some of the best sex.
Yeah.
Just saying. but also a really nice person who understood his own boundaries very well and was able to communicate them, something that the majority of Christians cannot do.
Oh yeah. And I mean, you look at the satanic rules of the earth or the tenets of the Satanic Temple, 2 different churches, similar concept, really fucking good rules.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience with most Satanists that I've met. That's been my experience with people of almost every religion and no religion.
Right.
And after a point I had to come to the same conclusion that actually I think most people are all right. But when you tell yourself and you tell everyone around you that people are inherently evil and that you need somebody threatening you with eternal torment to keep you from being evil, that's going to attract some fucked up people.
Oh, for sure.
B, that's going to give some people who might not otherwise be fucked up kind of a free pass in their own mind. And
because it's okay, because Jesus will forgive me.
Yeah,
so it's fine.
Jesus will forgive me whatever I do, and I can't be good anyway.
Right.
And even if I am good, it doesn't matter, because that's not what gets you to heaven.
Right.
It's faith that gets you to heaven.
Right.
Not what you do or don't do.
Right. Well, depending on whether or not you believe in eternal salvation, which is a whole other topic for a different podcast.
Yeah.
But
absolutely, that resonates with me. The more people I met who weren't Christian and weren't terrible and were actually more compassionate in a lot of ways than everyone I had known as a child, the harder it became to say, okay, this is what's going to save the world.
I think for me, there were 2 really big moments that stand out for me as this was the final nail in the coffin. I had pretty much done a lot of the work and was just holding on for the reasons I said, really just to not upset the apple cart, to keep my parents happy and all this other stuff. And so all of that's going on. And I started thinking about the Tower of Babel, of all things. I started thinking about the Tower of Babel, and I just think that didn't happen. And that small thought was like a big hammer falling down. It was that's not how that went down. That didn't happen.
Yeah.
And somehow in my brain, that just flipped the switch of okay, then we can let the rest of it go. If this is a myth about different languages and all kinds of different mythologies and other belief systems have myths about the origin of languages, this is not unique. It's not even that creative, if we're being honest. It didn't happen. And there are lots of people who have other really cool stories of things that didn't happen that are better than this. That was a big moment. I think the other big moment, sort of like we were discussing, was the Bible says, do unto the least of these what you would do for me. Mm-hmm. Christ says that. Do for the least of these what you would do for me. My experience with Christians has often been to shit on the least of these. Mm. I did a lot of volunteer work because that was actually part of my high school experience. I had to volunteer for my Bible class. Saw the way that people treated people that they perceived to be less than, and often felt like, I don't think this is what Jesus had in mind.
Yeah.
Once I got divorced and sort of put that side of things to the side, right? And I started thinking about what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, I was like, you know what? I think I really do want to work with the least of these. I want to work with the people who are hurting, with the orphans and the widows and the people that the Bible tells us to be good towards. Like, that's what I want to do. So I'm going to find a way to do that. Fast forward a little bit, I spent a year working in a residential substance abuse facility where residents would come and live in the facility for about 3 to 4 weeks. And I ran groups there and would educate and, help process different emotions about trauma and substance use and how all these things work together. And I remember very clearly, probably about 90% of the people who sat in those rooms would say that they identify as Christian. Mm-hmm. There's so much stigma around substance use. It's not funny. Like, we'll do an episode on it because it's such something I'm really passionate about. I remember having the conversation with them in groups, talking about, like, this is the kind of shit Jesus would be doing. Mm-hmm. Like, if Jesus were here today, he'd be working my job. He'd be doing social work jobs, honestly, because that's really where God's work is being done, because that's more than I could even handle. But, like, that's where Jesus would be. He would be in the nitty gritty. He's not going to be at the pulpit.
Mm-hmm. Oh God, if Jesus were here today, the Christian right would crucify him again.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Without a second doubt.
Thinking about moments, because it's really hard for me, because my grandmother used to say I had a spirit of rebellion because I asked questions and was too literal. And
my dad, the way that he phrased it was, I was the toughest one to raise. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's my spicy brain.
Yeah.
But, and the early childhood trauma probably didn't help.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely always had trouble with the idea of just blindly following authority. Mm-hmm. And I would ask why. And I heard because I said so a lot, mm-hmm. which is possibly in the top 10 worst phrases you can say.
Yeah, for real. To anyone.
I always was kind of suspicious of power. And I was always of the idea that you don't respect authority just because somebody says they have authority. They have to earn it.
Yeah.
They have to prove why they deserve to be the one who tells you what to do and why you should listen to them. Did not go over well in most situations, but having that suspicion of power never extended to God or even necessarily to the church until I was in college in my freshman year, and I took a world history class. In public school in the United States, we don't typically get world history. Like, we might get a little bit it's kind of creepy how the world history we do get kind of is like the very specific pieces that kind of back up whatever you're learning at church.
Or like the nationalist narrative that's already happening in your American history classes.
Yeah, like we'll spend a lot of time in American history and the stuff that kind of bolsters that narrative, but we don't really get into the nitty-gritty of world history. Well, I took a world history class, and it was like a 2-part situation. So we got really into the nitty-gritty of everything. And one of the aspects of it that really stood out to me was the role of the Christian church in history and the role it played and why schisms happened and why new denominations were formed and how involved churches were in power plays. And that was a massive light bulb moment, because in my own experience, I think I had never really thought about the role that power had played in the little schism that we went through when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But looking back, it was so clear. It was like, oh, this didn't have anything to do with belief. This didn't have anything to do with the right or wrong way to be a Christian. This was all about who had power.
Yep.
And throughout history, like if you ever, if you really want to deconstruct yourself fast, just look into the history of like how the church has either been used for power or used power.
Yeah, misused
power
is often probably a better.
How the things that were illegal, the things that the church declared like not okay, had a lot more to do with preserving its own power.
Yep.
Than it did with what anything that had to do with theology.
Right.
The more I learned about that, the less I was able to have any belief in any of it.
Do you remember, was it us who was having the conversation about Martin Luther?
I don't know if we've ever talked about Martin Luther.
Okay, then it must have been talking to my partner about it. Yeah, because I was telling him about how he married a nun. But I have so much respect for Martin Luther, even though he's also super problematic. I super respect what he did as far as like standing up to the church and being like, no, you can't do this. You can't do it. Like, this is not what God wanted. And like, he also had his own problems. I'm not going to say that he was like God's gift to mankind, because he wasn't. But it was also just like, wow, somebody actually had the balls to do it. And I just appreciate that about him. My last point, sort of before I kind of want to share some resources or just like some things that helped me. I am not religious. I don't consider myself a theist, but I do actively practice like spirituality. My identity, I guess, or what I'm most comfortable with calling it, is like being a pagan witch, because I like pagan mythology, and I like the stories, and I like the images and the way that people, and especially women, are represented in a lot of pagan myths. Even though I don't worship those deities, I sort of honor them, I guess, in a way, as like the ideas that they represent. And I say all that to say, like, I don't think that walking away from religion means that you have to stop being interested in the things that you're interested in or finding comfort in spiritual practice. I have a much different view of what spirituality is now than I did when I was a Christian. Mostly because I feel like it's a more accurate view of being spiritual than just like following a set of rules. I do things and I participate in things that make me feel like a better person and that lift my spirits, as it were. And those are like, what else is being spiritual if not that? And I think that it's important to make that distinction, that like you can not just like be atheist and pagan, but you can also like be atheist and spiritual. Like those things don't have to be completely opposite ideas. And I think it's important to know that. There you go. We can do a whole episode about witchcraft and stuff too, because I can't stop talking about it.
Oh, I would love that. I'd love to come at it from the perspective. So on my end, I genuinely don't have like a word for like an easy descriptor for what I believe.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't think there's anything to the Bible, genuinely. I don't think that God is all powerful and all good. I think that if there is a God, I hope that they're simply not all powerful, because the alternative is terrifying. I will say that I still find comfort in prayer sometimes, especially if I'm going through it or somebody I love is going through it. I almost think of it as there's somebody listening who cares, even if they can't do anything. It's kind of like talking to your friend about your problems. Your best friend may not be able to solve all of your problems, but they care and they listen, and sometimes it's what you need in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I view prayer and how I view God. I would much rather that there's a God out there who cares so much, even if they can't do anything but witness and listen, than to think that there's a God out there that treats us like toys.
Yeah. I think that another interesting episode might be like just our philosophies on existence, because I feel like we're heading into an area that we don't have time to discuss.
and I would say too, like in terms of just deconstruction, always be aware, like as something I see a lot when people are deconstructing, and something I had to confront within myself as well, is people who throw out the beliefs without throwing out the mindset of Christianity.
Yes.
Like not being willing to look at if something stands up to scrutiny or not. That was a big problem I had with dealing with Christianity, was how much people weren't willing to subject their beliefs to scrutiny because on some level they knew it wouldn't stand up.
Yeah.
And for me, it didn't. When I started really digging into what I had been taught to believe, it simply didn't stand up to any level of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And so I had to discard it.
I think, if I may, I think for me, that showed up as a false sense of confidence. Again, I was just recently talking to a friend about it and apologizing for, we've been friends for several years now, apologizing for that period where I thought I was the shit because I wasn't a Christian anymore. And I, like, there's that false sense of confidence that comes with being a Christian of, like, I know everything there is to know because I have the one truth, and that truth is Jesus, and you can't tell me different because that is what I believe. And I carried that mindset into, you can't tell me what to believe because I have psychology, and psychology is going to tell me everything I need to know about your stupid little brain. And then blah, 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 blah. Like, it was that same level of arrogance that then, and honestly, I think I have to give a lot of credit to my brother and the people in my life who have chosen to be patient with me, including my partner, because that took some undoing. It took some undoing. And I know, like this friend I was talking to, I know that I hurt them unintentionally because I was still dealing with my own shit. And I'm grateful that she stuck around and was like, yeah, like that sucked and I don't love that part of your personality, but I see that it's changing.
Yeah.
So.
And I actually went through the same thing. Like, I feel like it's kind of that thing where if you've been in a cult, you're more likely to join another cult if you leave because you're still in that mindset, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I, especially in my early 20s, had a very black and white mindset. Mm-hmm. I got very into objectivism at one point. I feel like that's something that a lot of people coming out of evangelical Christianity fall into the objectivist pipeline if they're not careful. I thankfully crawled my way out. But
you've been reading my nonfiction book, you know.
Yeah.
You know that's something I deal with.
But yeah, like that being, be wary of anybody who tells you they have all the answers because nobody has all the answers.
Except for us.
And I would just say too, something that I found I really struggled with was being reflexively negative about all religion, all belief, and having to come to terms with the fact that every religion is not Christianity.
Yeah. Thank God.
Like,
well, whatever version of God you believe in.
And also specifically that the two religions that Christianity often claims to be like the correct version of, Judaism and Islam.
Yeah.
Christianity has nothing to do with either of those.
No.
At all. And isn't
maybe with Judaism, but that's like
only in an appropriative sense. I could do a whole episode on the appropriation of
for sure.
Jewish belief in Christianity and the adulteration of Jewish belief to bolster Christianity.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
But I would say be very, very wary of painting all religions with the same brush because the problems you have with Christianity do not exist in every religion. And then just, deconstruction is not really about finding a new certainty. It's more about making room for uncertainty and getting comfortable with not knowing all the answers.
Yeah.
And navigating that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would say I have a couple of recommendations of pieces of media if you are specifically looking for something that sort of looks at this idea a little bit more directly or a little bit more objectively, because I think that is part of it, is having to learn how to be objective because so much of Christian belief is subjective, how it makes you feel, right? So there's this really great podcast called Oh No, Ross and Carrie that I absolutely love. It's called Oh No, Ross and Carrie because they go and they take a scientific approach towards different belief systems. That includes like ear candling. It includes like oxygen bars, and it includes different religions as well. It's a very interesting podcast. Highly recommend for people who are sort of more analytical in their mindset and needing some of that solid evidence to stand on. I would also, if you are one of those people who's like, I sort of just need to find the humor in all of this. I need to find a way to make this funny, or if I don't laugh about it, I'm going to cry. There's a really great podcast called Mega, which is about a fake mega church.
Oh boy.
And the hosts have on different comedians who are like, the idea is that the church is so big that they're interviewing all of the church members one by one. And so it's going to take forever to do, essentially. And so they have these comedians come on and talk about their new mission in the church. There was a great episode with Thomas Middleditch, whom I am absolutely in love with, who talks about his ministry flying planes for people.
Huh.
It's very funny. So anyway, yeah, he talks about how he like ran into his wife while he was driving the plane. Anyway, it's great. So if you're looking for the funny side of it, I highly recommend Mega.
Nice. I have a few as well.
Go for it.
I blame Bill on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of their videos have to do with just talking through the logical fallacies at the heart of Christian doctrine, which they typically do in a very, like, they get sassy sometimes if somebody's really rude in their comments and they're responding to it, but it's very, like, calm, logical, respectful, clear, and also just very soothing voice to listen to.
Fair.
Another one is the Evangelical-ish podcast. This is a group of, pastors, youth pastors, people who are either in the deconstruction process or have deconstructed, talking about that process and talking about the different things, like the different issues in the church. And some of them are still Christians. Mm-hmm. Some of them, deconstructed to a point of, I still have my faith. Yeah. But how I relate to it is different now. Mm-hmm. And how I tell people about it is different now. Yeah. So that's there. And then if you haven't seen the Hillsong documentary,
I was just going to say that.
Especially if you are a millennial, if you were a teenager in the early 2000s, the Hillsong documentary will honestly be a little bit horrifying. Yeah. Because it was like looking at a template that I didn't know my own youth group was using. Yeah. To keep us in that space. Yeah. And it's extremely eye-opening. Yep.
I know, he's so thirsty. I'm sorry, guys. He just, can't help himself. Are you done? Thank you.
He's so thirsty.
Sorry. If you can stomach watching documentaries that criticize religious institutions, I highly recommend it. Or even if you can't really stomach it, like maybe having a friend on dial that you can text about it or live tweet about it or something. Cause I know it's difficult, but a lot of times going through that experience can be really cathartic because there is this eye-opening sense of it was never what I thought it was. The pieces of it that I loved were never really whole. And that is a crappy feeling, but it's also a good feeling. I was talking with a client today and made a comment about, they were saying, with all due respect, therapy sucks. And I said, yeah, it does. I was like, but there are a lot of people who decide not to do it, and they go out there and they keep hurting others. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. Therapy does suck sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Deconstruction sucks. It's going to hurt. But there are a lot of people who choose not to do it and keep hurting other people. Yeah. And so if you are feeling like this is a direction that you're headed, or this is a direction that you've already gone, and you want that validation, I'm here to validate you. It is not fun.
It hurts. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's a loss.
Absolutely. And grief over that loss is not abnormal, nor is it unwarranted. Yeah. I think if there's anything that I miss from that time, it's the community and the confidence.
Oh, yeah.
The rest of it, I've found ways to be happy.
Yeah, the community, the certainty. I'm working on the community part, but the certainty, I've had to make peace with the fact that I'll never be that certain again about anything. Yeah. And that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I don't think I've made peace with it yet.
It's hard to make peace with.
It is. I think part of that's the ADHD. I have to be right about everything. So
the world is big and scary, and I don't know all the answers, and that sucks. I really wish I did.
Which there is something comforting in that then, because again, like you're used to that cognitive dissonance. Well, some things you just aren't gonna know. Mm-hmm. But now it's left up to a whole host of things that can't be known. Yeah. And somehow that's better than somebody who's keeping it from you.
Yeah, I am kind of comforted by the idea that there's not somebody who's just bigger and more powerful than me that has all of the answers and isn't sharing them.
Yeah.
It's just that there aren't easy answers sometimes. And that very rarely are there easy answers.
Yeah.
In fact. And I find that kind of freeing. I actually find the idea that there's no single purpose for my life freeing too. I used to be terrified that I was going to miss it. I would do one wrong thing and then I'd be off of God's path for my life. And I'd be wasting my talents. I'd be doing everything wrong. Mm-hmm. I'd be a sad story. I'd never be happy. And now it's like, oh, there's no God. There's no plan. There's no purpose. Mm-hmm. I was always told that was terrifying.
Yeah.
But I actually am so relieved. I'm so glad there's no plan.
I love that. I want to kind of end on a story that I said if we had time I would share, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I remember being in church and being told this story of these missionaries coming across this woman in some big city, like New York or something like that. She claimed to be a witch, and they started talking with her and having a conversation with her about her beliefs and her faith and all of these things. And she was asking these questions and, sort of ended up inviting them back to her hotel room to continue the conversation. Well, they get back there, and of course she starts trying to seduce them and all this other stuff. And they're like, no, that's not going to happen. And one of them realizes in that moment that she's possessed by a demon, and so starts exorcising her. She just starts having this really violent reaction to it. And so, all this is going on, and then, it's all said and done, and she's standing there or laying on the floor in her lingerie, just a mess from this exorcism, and is like so grateful, like, oh, thank you, and ask them to leave. Now, when I was in the church, that story was a story of, see how great God is, see how amazing he is that he chose to save this evil woman from this terrible thing, right? Now, as an atheist witch, I'm like, queen. She fucking was like, come back to my hotel room. I'm going to put on some lingerie, and then I'm going to try to seduce y'all. And they're like, no, we're not going to do it. And try to exercise her. And she's like, okay, fine. And plays up the drama. Oh my God. I'm like, this woman is my hero. She is fantastic. She's like, oh yeah, I have a demon inside me. Oh I love it. So that's my fun story about.
She committed to the bit.
I know, that's it doesn't get better than that. Well, thank you for sticking around. I know this was a long one. What are we talking about next week, April?
The same thing we talk about every week, Krista. Whatever we want.
All right, have a good week, and we'll see you soon. Bye. If you can find me a perfectly innocent man, I will ruin his life.
Oh no.
No, I just mean that my partner's perfectly innocent. Oh, and I'm ruining it because I'm ADHD and terrible.
A gremlin.
A gremlin.